Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 142, How the Sausage is Made in Sheet Music, with Dan Forrest. In this episode, I have renowned composer and publisher Dan Forrest on the show to talk about kind of the state of the publishing industry. Not only Dan's own story and how he got involved in the publishing industry as well as being a composer, but some of his thoughts in particular about the past of the traditional publishing industry, as well as some of the changes that have happened over the last few years, and we even get into our thoughts about ways to make it better in the future. And not only better for composers, because Dan feels very strongly about the way composers should be compensated. As a composer and a publisher himself, he sees both of those sides, and it's a really good way to think through some of those issues. But he's also interested in making the experience better for us as choir directors buying music. We talk about adjusting to changes in technology. Does copyright need to change in order for to keep up with the technology? So this conversation is really interesting. It kind of drifts back and forth between the perspective of the director and the composer. I think you'll enjoy this one, so stick around and listen to all the way to the end. And of course, don't forget, you can use your Choralosophy checkout code to get a discount, a very, very helpful discount for you and your choir program at sightreadingfactory.com every time you renew and buy your students the memberships, which is really important. And every time you get sheet music at graphitepublishing.com, at ryanmain.com, and you can also use the code at mymusicfolders and mychoirrobes.com. And of course, recently we brought back Voce Vista to the show, which means that you can go to choralosophy.com/voce-vista and get a module there that will allow you to buy either the regular version or the pro version of their overtone analyzing software, which can revolutionize your classroom's ability and your choir's ability at any age level to understand the sound that they are making. So check out that page there and you can see some demos. You too can go over to the Patreon page, patreon.com/choralosophy, and for $3 a month, get into a supporting community over there that really keeps this show going, and maybe just because you appreciate that I do this work every week for you, for free, and that's your way of saying thank you. The producers at Patreon are Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Okay, everybody, I'm here with Dan Forrest. Dan, of course, needs no introduction for choir nerds that love to sing his music, but I'm excited to get to know the actual Dan Forrest here on the podcast, so welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Chris. Glad to be here with you. Sorry
So
it's taking me so long to get on here.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm really excited, and the great part about doing this show is that I am the boss of the schedule. So if it doesn't work out for a while, then I just keep pestering people until we get them. And so it's good stuff. Let's get started by just having you share with folks a little bit about your origin story with choral music, kind of a short biographical that gets you to what you're doing today.
Yeah. My joke is that I was a pianist long before I was ever a musician. I was ready to conquer the world on my piano bench and impress everybody with my cascading octaves and things.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 10th grade, I went to a choral festival that was, it drew schools from probably a 2 or 3 hour radius. And it was so far beyond anything else that I had ever experienced. And that was, as I've looked back, I've realized that was kind of the turning point where I kind of wanted to be where the singing was and not just where the pianists were. It's a lot more fun. And I love the instrument that's housed in the person, that is part of the person. I love the way that breath, the thing that keeps us alive, connects to the way that we create beauty, and all that stuff just doesn't happen at the piano where you plunk down a note and then the tone decays. And no matter how hard you keep pressing, you don't get any more sound. So that was kind of the turning point. And then in college, my love of improvising and arranging and doing some composing too kind of blended with hearing better and better choral ensembles, to where I wanted to be writing for the singers, not just the pianists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So my first published piece was during my master's in piano performance. And that kind of created some tension in my mind, like which of these things is supposed to be my main gig. I eventually did a doctorate in composition at the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk,
Okay.
and then it was, should I be a theory teacher who composes or a composer who teaches theory? And I just felt like I was at 80% of full capacity or full potential on both. And in 2012, I stepped down from my teaching post to just compose and start editing too, but just primarily compose. And I literally turned in my office key on a Saturday and started writing my Requiem 2 days later on Monday morning.
Wow.
And that's gone on to be my best known piece. And I truly think it could not have happened if I was trying to teach and compose at the same time. So
Yeah.
hats off to everybody who does both of those things, because I just wasn't capable of it. And it's amazing to me that other people can. And I respect them, that they're able to do something I'm not
Yeah.
literally capable of. So much respect there. From
So
there,
would
it's
you
just been a
say,
lot of coding and editing.
yes, sorry, I had a question there about part of that story. So would you say that that moment where you turned in your office key and started writing the next week, was that, would you call that a leap of faith? Is that kind of what you were doing at the time, or was that conscious at the time, or did you look back on it and conceive of it differently?
Um, you know, it would be romantic and dramatic of me to say, yeah, it was just, I just followed my heart and did what I had to do in spite of the cost. It really wasn't like that.
Okay.
I was already, like, financially, I had more income coming from my choral publishing than I did from my teaching post. And I was already writing a lot of music. And I just didn't have enough time to do everything that I wanted to do. So
Mm,
it really wasn't a whole lot of risk at that point. The hard part was leading up to there, where I was trying to keep both plates spinning, and then things got easier at that point for me, actually.
I see. So tell us a little bit about the publishing hat then that you wear, so people have that context.
Yeah, I started, my first published choral piece was in 2001 with Beckenhorst Press. And then over the next 5 to 7 or 8 years, I published with like 12 or 13 different publishers, just kind of shotgun approach, just threw it all against the wall to see where it would stick, where it would settle in. And as it turned out, far and away, my best publisher was Beckenhorst. And that's where I work now as editor.
Ah,
So I kind
okay.
of started at the very bottom of the ladder, and eventually, now I help all these other composers hopefully do that same thing that I was trying to start doing in 2001. I also did publish concert music with Hinshaw starting in 2005, and then as of 2017, so I was with them for 12 years, and then in 2017 I started self-publishing my concert music and publishing traditionally with Beckenhorst for my sacred music, my church anthems.
Yeah.
So I kind of have a foot in both of those worlds at this point.
Right. So yeah. So what you started out, just to make sure I'm getting this right. So you started out writing music kind of in the traditional way, submitting to publishers
Mm-hmm.
in the early years, and had some success selling some of those. And then as your career progressed, you were able to then land a more, I guess, a more permanent gig with as a publisher, or sorry, as an editor. And so what is that? How does that change the way that you look at the pieces of music that are in front of you as being having, I guess, kind of started from the bottom, like you said? How does that inform your day-to-day job?
Yeah. Well, we couldn't have planned that better, because you're opening the door for me to talk about things that I really care about. I There are a lot of, not a lot of, there are some stories out there of like terrible experiences with traditional publishers, and publishers kind of gobbling up a piece but then not paying their royalties or not treating composers well, or all this stuff. And I the editors that I hang out with are people who started as composers like this, and they at one time were sending in their pieces trying to figure out who would publish what. So that's me at Beckenhorst, that's Brandon Boyd at Gentry, that's Susan Labar at Walton, that's Katie Houts I was with a couple weeks ago at ACDA at Choristers Guild. It's all people who know what those rejection letters feel like, and know what it's like to try to be finding your way and figuring out where your pieces belong and how you might find some success and get noticed and all those things. So I'd like to think my goal is to be a composer first publisher, a publisher who has composers' interests at the very top of the priority list and make sure that composers are treated well, because without composers, we don't have anything to publish. We're
Right.
dependent on that. And it's really important, especially when there are other options like self-publishing these days. We have to make the case that traditional publishing is worth it, and that
Yeah.
self-publishing isn't automatically a better way to go for everybody for all pieces.
So how would you make that case? Let's say let's pretend that I can write music, which I can't, but let's pretend that I could, and we're sitting here having a conversation, and you're trying to convince me to sell me on the idea that the traditional publishing route is still the way to go. Make your pitch. What do you say?
Yeah, funny thing, I just wrote an article on this.
Okay, great.
That'll come out in a couple weeks, but yeah, it's just kind of pulling together a lot of thoughts that I've had, and other people have had too, over the last several years. Um, there are 9 things that I list in that article that I think it's important just not to miss. It's not that traditional publishing is always better for everybody and that nobody should self-publish or anything like that. Like, I do both, and I really feel like we're all in this together. But I think traditional publishing, when done well, offers some really helpful things that make it probably a better first choice for most composers to try first and see if it'll
Mm-hmm.
work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that would be things like curation, first of all. The idea that an editor comes through, and if they do their job well and they know their market well, they're helping decide what is really going to do best in the market and help it be visible. Um, there are so many pieces in the self-publishing marketplaces these days. And it's because there isn't any kind of curation or vetting in a lot of those. Now, some of them do, and that's helpful. But pretty much anybody can hang out their shingle these days, and there's so many people trying to do that. There is kind of a seal of approval that comes from a trusted publisher with their customer base that says, "Hey, we think you might like this,"
Mm-hmm.
and it helps pieces stand out. I think the editing is really important. And when I say editing, I don't mean just like figuring out the layout of a piece or the engraving. I mean more like helping a piece be the very best version of itself that it can be, solving as many problems as can be solved in advance. So when you end up with it in your hands in your choir rehearsal, it just sings off the page and it just works. And you do the first read and everybody's like, "Oh man, wow," because we've smoothed out all the rough places as much as possible and fixed the voice leading, and just made it so it works.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that kind of interaction is really helpful. I think that's what like an author would typically do. You hire an editor to help your piece be your book, your novel, to be the best version of itself that it can be. I think that's that sharpening is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Production. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was going to say, so if you, with that curation, with that editing, that obviously in most cases you don't have access to if you're self-publishing, does do you ever run up against I guess the artistic butting of the heads? Where does the line between I'm editing and I'm curating start? Where does the line of like, no, you're telling me artistically what I need to do? How do you dance that dance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I think I have to keep in front of me every time I sit down to work on somebody else's music. On the other hand, that is exactly what I had to do when I taught composition grad students.
Mm-hmm.
When my master's students came into me, it wasn't my job to make them write music the way I would write it. I didn't need them to sound like me. And that sort of thing does happen at certain times in grad school programs. Like, oh, if you go there, you're going to come out a minimalist, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, KU was not like that for me at all. KU was, we want to find out what road you're on, help you go as far as possible on that road, and broaden it as you do it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would take that same approach with editing other people's music for publication. It's not how can I project my own voice onto this, but how can I listen to what this piece is trying to say, and where is it like giving signals or bringing up cues, or Leonard Meyer would say implication realization, like where are the implications that aren't being realized as successfully and completely and effectively as they could be. I want to put my finger on that and point that out to that composer and say, do you sense this the way I sense it? If so, do you have a potential solution for that? If not, here's something that might work. But if you don't like it, feel free to come up with something else. But it just feels like a little bit of a weakness to me. See what you think.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when I'm starting out with a composer I haven't worked with in the past, I think it's really important to earn trust with them. So I try really hard to frame things carefully and say, like, do you sense this? Do you feel that? And if they don't, then well, maybe I'm off, you know.
Right.
But the majority of the time they're like, oh yeah, I see what you're saying there, and if I can earn that kind of trust, and then the piece gets out there and does really well, then my name's not on it and it doesn't need to be on it. I just did my job to help that piece like get past some of its own drawbacks. But it's that composer's voice, not my voice. And I'm just helping the piece do what it wanted to do. Same as
Yeah.
I would with like a grad student. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally does. It totally. Now, are there a couple other pros of the, like, I guess I'm going to drive us to a pro and con kind of a thing with
Sure.
the traditional publishing route. Do you want to throw a couple more pros in there before we get to some cons?
Yeah. Of course, taking care of all the production, publishers are used to doing that. So you don't have to start out from scratch and figure out whether you're going to do print or digital or warehousing or accounting or all that stuff. The strength of marketing and the budget for it is extremely significant as publishers leverage all the connections that they have. Of course, their customer base, like if you're a self-publisher and you could buy a mailing list of like 22,000 addresses to send your product to, you would have like I found the pot of gold, but
Uh-huh.
that's what a good publisher has developed over the last who knows how many decades. They've built that customer base, and if they've kept their mailing list clean or their email list clean, then those are people who are eager to get that music, and they know, boy, when they put out something, like that's something I need to take a look at. That's what I'm
Hmm.
trying to leverage as a publisher.
Yeah.
Taking care of licensing is a big thing, increasingly big post-pandemic with all the streaming that's going on. Taking care of accounting, customer service, the sense of community that comes, I think, as being part of a group. And you can do that with self-publishing collectives too, to be fair. There's some really strong senses of community in some of those. I even end up like recommending composers for a commission periodically. People call the publisher and be like, I want a new piece. Who do you recommend? Just this past week, somebody wrote me and said, I want a kind of up and coming composer to write a piece for us. Who would you recommend? So I got 3 people from the Beckenhorst catalog and said, hey, check out these people. Here's what they've written. Here's what I think they do well. And then I
Hmm.
wrote those 3 people and said, hey, I recommended you. You might be hearing from somebody.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like networking type benefits that work there
Yeah.
too. I could go on with some little things, but that's probably enough.
Yeah, no, that's good. So, so then if we think about, and maybe not even putting it in the con category would be the right way to do it, but thinking about the about the self-publishing route, and or if you throw in there like just the kind of the digital only publishing type websites, the non-traditional publishers, what are the advantages there, as you kind of look at, with 20 plus years in this industry of what might be the right type of piece to publish in that non-traditional way, what might be the right type of composer, and what are the advantages of that side of things?
Yeah. In no particular order, a traditional publisher can only put out so much music. And so, like if at Beckenhorst, we put out 30 new pieces a year out of like hundreds and hundreds, not thousands, but hundreds that get submitted every year. And if I were to like rank them like on a percentile scale, sort of, I might be publishing like meaning Beckenhorst, might be publishing the top like 98 to 100th percentile of what I get submitted. But that
Hmm.
doesn't mean that everything else is in the 0 to 5 range. You know, like there's stuff in the 90 to 98 range. And
Yeah.
that's the music that I would like to see either go to some other publisher that just wasn't quite going to work for us, but it belongs somewhere. People need to know it. And I'll do that. Like I'll write a rejection letter that says like, this doesn't quite work for us, but I could hear this maybe working at so and so. Send
Uh-huh.
it over to whoever, editor friend that I know. They might be interested in. I can't speak for them, but I wonder if this might work for them. And I've had other publishers like thank me, like, hey, thanks for sending that over our way. That worked really well for us.
Hmm.
So that 90 to 98 or whatever, I'd like to see those find a life somewhere. It could be another traditional publisher, or it could be that like it's just not quite right for anybody, but there are going to be people who want it. I think that's a brilliant use of self-publishing.
Mm-hmm.
There's also some niche type things, like Katie Houts, my friend who works at Choristers Guild. She has her Rise Up Children's Choir, and it's a unique setup, unique origin, unique voicing that they do. It all arises out of music videos that they make. It doesn't. I mean, she works at a traditional children's choir publisher, but those she self-publishes. It's just kind of a specialty sort of thing that's just a better fit. And they have good visibility because of what they do. And she knows how to run it because she's in the industry. She knows how all this stuff works. So that's a better fit for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of good music that just didn't quite make it, but that doesn't mean it should have no visibility. It needs a home and a platform.
Right.
What I would like to see though is more selectivity on the part of self-publishers rather than like throwing everything against the wall. They're just throwing it all out there in the hopes that something might catch on, or I might sell 10 of those or 20 of the, like if you're not careful, you shoot yourself in the foot because you're not putting your best work out there. And then people are forming their impressions of who you are as a composer based on work that isn't really your best.
Right.
When you publish with a traditional publisher, you have kind of that. I mean, gatekeeper would be the negative sense of the word.
Right.
You have that vetting or that editing that says like, this is a piece that everybody needs to know about, and we're going to get behind it. With self-publishing, there's not always that there. So I think it's really healthy for self-publishing composers, or maybe composers who traditionally publish, but also use self-publishing for some of their pieces that don't get in that door. Just be selective. Like, is this really the piece that represents me as the very best that I can? 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, am I going to want to be known for this piece? Or will people have formed an impression of me so that even if I continue to grow and become a better composer, people are going to have kind of pigeonholed me for where I was back then because there wasn't any kind of selectivity or vetting going on.
If your school or church are in the market for staging products like risers, shelves, podiums, movable platforms, all of the things that you need to set your choir up for success, I would like to strongly urge you to check out StageRight. StageRight's products are sturdy, they're durable, they're easy to use. I have personal experience with the acoustical shelves and some of the platforms that they have at StageRight, and I can tell you, compared to some of the more expensive competitors, they are a really great option to fit inside of a tight school budget, but also to give you the durability and usability that you need. So check out StageRight at stageright.com. I imagine that for composers that are self-publishing, or they're self-selecting essentially which of their pieces make it onto their website or whatever, that evaluation, that critical evaluation of one's own work would be very difficult, to the point where you're either going to be super critical of your own work to the point where everything sucks, or it's you're going to think something's great because it came out of your own process, but then it having that third party, that like objective third party to give you some of that feedback, it sounds like might be like kind of the number one thing that sets traditional publishing aside from doing it on your own.
Yeah, it's got to be at the top of the list, at least from my vantage point. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
A lot of the self-publishing platforms too are just so crowded. I mean, like JW Pepper's My Score has thousands of self-publishing composers in there, and tens of thousands of pieces to sort through. So there are some that rise to the top, sure, but it's difficult to get noticed. And even JW Pepper, like in this article I wrote, they were willing to go on record with a quote that says, like, hey, self-publishing has a purpose, but we think traditional publishing is the best first stop for most composers.
Yeah.
So I mean, My Score has a purpose, and they're trying to drive it, certainly. But at some point it just kind of mushrooms into this massive thing, and then everybody just kind of, not everybody, a lot of people kind of get lost in it. I think I would like to see a place like that, and I think they would too. Just have a little more like self-curation, like, all right, here's the one that I really want people to see.
Yeah. Now I wonder, because one of the things that I was going to take you, one road I was going to take you down anyway, was this idea that at least in other industries throughout the history of, I guess, economic development and the ways we sell and market things to people and to each other, what tends to happen is that a big, I guess we'd call it like a giant, which would be the legacy industry, whether it be traditional publishing versus these smaller, more nimble outfits, either kind of grow old and grow fat and lazy and die, or they start to take on the best of the new ideas and incorporate them into what it is that they're doing. And you brought up just now the J.W. Pepper idea of the self-publishing and how that can be challenging. But do you still see that that traditional publishing may have to adapt to those technological advances and those types of how easy it is to share music socially and share music, almost instantly? How do you see that balancing out, let's say, in the next 20 years? Like, what are your prognostications or guesses?
Yeah, I had some thoughts until you got to predict the next 20 years. Yikes. Yeah, that's tricky. I can definitely talk about like where things are heading at the moment.
That's fine.
Uh, and we'll see kind of whether that extends out to 20 years. I think for one, I mentioned earlier, like publishers can't take composers for granted. It used to be that traditional publishers were the gatekeepers and you had to get through the gate. And so everybody was clamoring at the gate, trying to find a way through. And
Yeah.
publishers could just kind of sit back and, scratch their fat bellies and be like, okay, well, everybody wants us. Let's see who we're going to take. Now I think it's really important that we make the case, not
Hmm.
just by like me writing an article, but primarily by how we operate as traditional publishers. It's important that we treat composers well, that we represent their interests, that they feel like they have ownership, that they haven't just signed their life away and lost all sense of control or a voice in the decision-making process.
Yep.
Of course, the big thing here is money, too. We haven't gotten to that yet. The traditional setup is that publishers only pay a 10% royalty.
Yeah.
So like you sell your $2 octavo, the composer got 20 cents. That's super long version, super long story short. That was set up many decades ago when publishers were utterly dependent on retailers to get the word out about their new music because there was no internet. So if we're a publisher, Beckenhorst in Columbus, Ohio, we want to sell music in Greenville, South Carolina, where I live, we need Pecknell Music here in town because they're our only link to all the choral directors here in Greenville. Because of that, it was set up at Keystone Retail setup, so 50% discount off the top. So out of that $2 octavo, $1 of it is going to the middleman, and 20 cents of it is going to the composer. Nowadays, with the internet, Beckenhorst can reach into Greenville, South Carolina pretty handily. So retailers have to prove their worth, not just like we're the only way you can reach people, but much more like here's the customer service we'll provide, or we will aggregate all these publishers together so that it becomes a one-stop shop or that kind of thing. So they have to kind of prove their worth. And in the meantime, you have self-publishing composers going, you're going to give me 10% while the middleman gets 50, and meanwhile, the publisher, after they pay that 50 and then pay the 10 to the composer, and then pay the print cost, at least on paper copies, which is often around 10%, they're trying to run their business on 30% of cover price.
Yeah.
Right. But then again, like there's all these caveats. The retailers were not getting filthy rich typically either. Like a vast majority of them have closed over the last 20 years. So it's not like anybody was necessarily just getting rich off all this. So it's just, to me, it's a system that needs some reevaluation. And we need to find ways to balance out those scales. There are needed roles. I mean, all of those. Here goes my camera moving because I moved my arm. Sorry.
Yeah, you're good.
All of those roles are important. We need all of that. But I would like to find ways to pay composers more than a tithe. More than move the decimal point one and okay, here's what you get. You're the person that wrote the piece, for Pete's sake. And I know what that's like because I am a composer. I know what move the decimal point. Here's what I get. So for one example, there are a couple publishers these days that are paying 30% royalties on digital sales. partly because the print cost is not a factor. And then like Beckenhorst, where I work, we only sell those digital products through our own website. So there's no middleman, there's no retailer cut involved in those, which
Yeah.
frees up our budget immensely. We just went from like 50% to 100%, and there's no print cost too.
Yeah.
So we basically take that extra 50% and split it with the composer and say, all right, we're going to do better so we can stay in business for you, and you're going to do better too. So even there, like being able to tell composers, look, you're going to get a 10% royalty on print and 30% on digital. That's a really nice thing to be able to tell people.
Uh-huh.
There's like a way through that ceiling, so to speak, that's been there for so long. And but it's not just us. There are other publishers doing that as well. Morningstar ECS does that, or does something similar
Uh-huh.
to that with 30%. So, I mean, that's just one example, but we're looking for ways to show composers like we're trying to make this a win-win setup here, not just like how can we use you, you know?
Right. Yeah, I know that part of this type of frustration for people is also just a certain type of economic illiteracy that happens where we assume that whatever the sticker price is, it kind of just goes magically to the profit of somebody. Like we're not
Right.
we're not very good at thinking about how much of the sticker price of an object we buy, how small the profit margins are for everybody involved in the production. I'm not sure how much of an, like I mentioned before we started, I'm an econ nerd. But have you ever heard of an essay called I Pencil?
No, I've not.
Okay, so in economics world, that's a really famous essay, and it's relatively short. I recommend everyone read it. But it's kind of talks about what you were just describing. It tells from the firsthand perspective of a pencil, all the way from its the rubber tree being sapped in the jungle of Brazil to the rubber going down the road to a plant to have the eraser made, and the trees being chopped down to shave off and to create the wooden casing of the pencil, and then somebody off in Africa goes into the copper mine and pulls out the copper for the little spools around it. It's like, and so you can kind of get an idea of where it's going, of like the pencil we buy is an incredibly an incredible product of human cooperation across the entire globe to get all these tiny little pieces, and that what you get is the pencil for 30 cents or whatever, and the company that brought it to you might actually get to keep 2 cents of that, or whatever it is. And so I think sometimes composers are guilty of that misunderstanding as well, in that, like, yeah, sure, the piece is $2.50, I should get to keep, almost all that. Well, but then how are you going to get the infrastructure that supports that piece, and where does that money go? So I wonder too, because all of the things you just said make total sense to me, of where the industry probably needs to go in terms of using the technology that's available to cut down on the overhead that has traditionally been there, so that it can be a win-win for everybody. Is there are you optimistic that seems to be the direction we're going, or is there a resistance to change in any kind of significant way that you see or that you feel?
That's a tough question. I feel optimistic about the pots that I have my hands in.
Okay,
I
good.
feel good about trying to move forward. There are other fronts that we're trying to do better on too, like in terms of giving composers a voice and how their music is used for licensing, for example. Like you kind of hire the publisher to be your licensing agent, but I think there's increasing amounts of publishers talking to composers saying, "Hey, here's this thing. What do you think about this? How would you like to handle this?" Which is one of the benefits of self-publishing, is just like making all the choices. I don't want traditional publishing to be okay, we take control and now you have no voice. I want it to be, we're working with you and for you, we're helping you, and you still have a voice in this because it's your piece, even though we're the ones who are managing the copyright.
Yeah.
Even on the licensing revenue, traditionally that's split 50-50. But we're looking at trying to change that ratio. I would love to be able to tell composers like you will get a majority of the licensing revenue, not even a 50-50 split.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think we're continuing to look for ways to make it win-win so that the composer isn't disadvantaged, but so that the publisher isn't struggling either with
Right.
those tight margins like you're talking about. But I think there's room for improvement. I think retailers have changed well too in terms of making the case for why they need to exist, um, and not necessarily presuming that, oh yeah, everybody's going to want to use us, or yeah, we're always going to have product to sell. There, with the other options on the table, I think it's making all the parts of that chain say, okay, we better do a good job here if we want to continue to thrive. And I think businesses are rising to that challenge.
Yeah, and I think I would say ultimately that's as it should be.
Hmm.
Complacency, like I said before, that's what causes companies to grow old, fat, and die.
Yeah,
That's ends up being what happens, and it's not just in our industry. So we've talked about so far about the composer publisher supply chain issues with in the industry, but I'd like to kind of move us now into where most of my audience is, which is in the classroom in directing choirs and how
sure.
these
Yeah.
types of things impact what we do. So, because I also see, I'm interested in what you think about from the consumer side, how some of these changes could also be benefiting us. And one of the areas that immediately comes to mind is whether or not we're going to figure out a way for copyright to keep up with the technology as well, with the kind of how frequent it is for singers to sing from their iPads, for example, or just the proliferation of digital exchange of scores, the proliferation of digital only purchasing that never gets printed at all. And I wonder, I can't imagine that that's not going to be a trend that only increases from here on out. And so, how do you see the publishing industry, traditional or otherwise, responding to that, and what types of conversations I'm sure you're already having about how that works?
Yeah. The low-hanging fruit would just be the like digital sale. We can start there, and then maybe you can expand further where you want to go on the
Hmm.
copyright front. For digital sales, there aren't many publishers that don't offer some kind of digital sale at this point.
Hmm.
That's where a lot of people are. And you're right, some of those people just want the instant delivery and no shipping charge. That's immensely helpful for us with international orders. Some countries where you're going to have to pay, huge taxes on what you import, or it may never even show up because the government may take it or something. That the digital gives us an in right to the customer. We can skip all those problems. Um, of course, some of those people are printing, and then some are wanting to just use on their device. Um, there are different approaches to that
Hmm.
with different publishers. There there are some means by which to try to control, how many copies can be proliferated or how many copies you can print or that sort of thing. Speaking for Beckenhorst, when we first sat down to decide, well, when we first spent a couple years figuring out how we wanted to sell digital, um, what we came down to is, look, there's always had to be trust. Ever since the photocopier was invented, the publisher has had to trust the customer.
Yeah.
And some of that war or that struggle was education. There were plenty of people that just gleefully used the photocopier because they just didn't understand what they were doing and why it was wrong and how it was hurting people, not just faceless businesses, but actual artists and employees and engravers and editors and all that kind of stuff. I think various lobbying entities and industry partners did a great job of making that clear. And yeah, there's still photocopying that goes on, but I think it's a lot less than it used to be. And we put our music out there and we let people buy just a few copies if they want. And we presume or hope that they have a good purpose for only those few copies.
Hmm.
And we just try to make it clear what they can and can't do. But ultimately, we can't like force everybody to not ever steal our music. We just do what we can to minimize it. So we take the same approach with digital sales. We actually sell the PDFs. We don't use a proprietary thing that requires a certain reader or certain software or whatever. We You make the purchase. We ask you to buy as many copies, to pay for as many copies as you're going to use, either print or digital, on your reader or print it off your printer. Whatever you're going to do, please pay for those, because our livelihood and our artists depend on it. And I think the more we phrase it that way, in terms of like, hey, people are here. We're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
People, real people, depend on the sale of this. So please use the digital the same way you would use the print.
Yeah.
I started well, when we first started selling digital, like one of the first months we did that, I went through and emailed everybody who ordered our minimum order of 5 copies on digital. We have that there just so that people aren't like, oh yeah, I'll just buy one. Like, no, you have to buy multiple copies, right? Because it's just to kind of aim people in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
But we keep it at 5, so it's not prohibitively expensive. Buying 5 digital copies with no shipping and handling is only a little bit more than buying 5 print copies and paying shipping and handling.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, buying 1 print copy and paying shipping and handling. So it's accessible. I emailed all those people just to see what they would say. And I got responses from a strong majority of them. And I was really pleasantly surprised at the responses that I got, and situations where people needed only 5 copies that I had never even thought about. Well, we just use that to get 1 copy in hand for our library for review. And then if we choose to actually do it, we don't want to use digital. We're going to buy the paper copy because we want the stapled, bound, cut version. So this is just the way that we review. Awesome.
Right.
We need 5 copies because when we decide what we're going to buy, we use a quartet, 1 on each part, and a pianist. So your 5 copy minimum is exactly what we needed. And we needed these 5 pieces to review for pieces we might sing next season. So that's why we ordered 5 copies of 5 different pieces. The list just went on. There were all these scenarios that I hadn't necessarily thought about, and it could have been easy for me to assume were nefarious, and they really weren't. So yeah, people steal digital, but I'm less interested in going through all kinds of rigmarole to try to make sure that nobody can possibly steal from us.
Right.
Call me a little bit naive, but I'd like to think that the people that buy our music are partnering with us to bring great music to life and want to support all that. And I'd rather just nurture that kind of positive spirit than try to be heavy-handed enough to make sure that nothing can ever go wrong. Of course, things are going to go wrong.
Of course,
But
yeah.
it's a risk we've always taken.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, and I think there is a little bit of naivete built into that, but in a lovable, adorable way, which is that which is that we do have to rely on the altruism of our colleagues in some aspects of this. But my concern, I guess, is as the technology needle shifts more and more, people's altruism really kind of runs out at the point of pain. And again, this is just me being an econ nerd again, is that pain in the economic sense is that when people have to add a bunch of steps to their process in order to quote, do the right thing, then that's where you tend to lose people. And so I think about things like, for example, if I buy a traditional paper copy of a song, and let's say I buy 50 copies. Well, in the old way of doing things for my entire career up until the last 8 or 9 years, is that meant I would get the piece in the mail, and we would perform it, and then I would collect it from all the singers, and I'd put it in the choir library, and then 5 or 6 years later, when we do that piece again, we pull it out, and we don't buy it again. We sing it from the copies that we used before, and there's markings on there from 6 or 7 years ago, and we use it again. And then in the digital landscape, it's a little bit different, because one of the biggest pain relievers that the digital copy can do for you is it eliminates the need, or could eliminate the need, for storage in a library, meaning that you pass it out, print it out, do the piece, toss it in the recycling, and you choose to do it 5 or 6 years later, and then all of a sudden you've got to print the piece again and or buy it. And that's that's my concern about creating a pain point in the market where, well, okay, now it's actually more trouble to do this piece again. And so then that's what kind of, and I don't know if you've heard about this, but or the idea of like a permanent file license comes into play, where maybe the publisher starts offering as an option, you can buy a per copy license, or you can buy the license for a higher dollar amount for this file forever.
Mhm.
That what are your thoughts about that kind of solution as a more of a long term thing?
I'm curious. I mean, in my understanding, that will require some sort of either trust or technology, right? There would have to be some sort
Yes.
of token or something that you would, yeah. And I don't, are we there yet? I'm not aware of anything that's actually really easily usable for publishers to enforce that kind of thing.
No, it wouldn't be like, it would still be a trust thing. It would be like,
Okay.
so at the point of sale, for example, I could choose to buy whatever fits my needs, like 20 copies of the file to print, like a single use print 20 times. Or, and let's say each of those is $2.50 or whatever. So that'd be what, 20 times 40, 50 bucks. Okay.
Mhm.
Or I could pay $70 once today, and I own that PDF to do with as I please forever. And for example, I think it's like, I think Ryan Main calls them site licenses or something. That's what he does on his website. You
Mhm.
pay $70 or $80 or whatever, or you can buy the per print. And I actually really like the idea because, again, yes, you're still going to have to adorably trust the colleague to do one thing or the other, but at least it gives us that option. Because to me, I see stuff like that as being more of like the solution in the long run to the choir library, which I think in a lot of places is just going to become more and more elite as we move, or sorry, obsolete is what I meant to say,
Mhm.
obsolete as we move away from paper stuff in general. Or do you not see the
Mhm.
paper going away as much as I do?
I don't, yeah, that's what everybody wants to know. JW Pepper points out that Amazon's digital sales of books tends to peak, last I heard them talk about it, tends to flatten out at about 25%.
Hmm.
And they don't expect, last I talked to them about it, their best guess is that they don't see the digital market becoming more than 25% of the sheet music industry anytime soon. I know of, keep people anonymous here. I know of one publisher that told me recently that 5% of their business, this is like a choral, a well-known concert choral publisher, 5% of their music is digital. I know of another publisher who is over 10%. It's up to more like 12. Um, so I think we're somewhere in that range at the moment. I don't think paper is going to go away very quickly. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
a fair amount of advantage to it still. I do think that as time goes on, some of the digital will only increase, like you say. I'm still curious about the scenario you're offering there. Is that like if you buy a site license, is that
Mm-hmm.
for unlimited copies or just your
Yes.
20 copies in perpetuity?
Unlimited copies. You own the
Yeah.
PDF
Okay.
to do
Okay. I
with
see what
as
you're
you
saying.
want. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've only seen that used in limited cases, and I haven't seen any of the big publishers go for it. I think I don't know. I'm kind of in the middle on this. I like the idea of selling per copy because I feel like we would lose revenue that we want to get, not just for ourselves but for the composer by just doing okay, you bought it, now you own it, and you can do it with as big a choir as you want for as long as you now shall live. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I'm probably missing out on revenue there. At the same time, I know people who are so keen. Oh, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. What was the other side? The one side is people who, yeah, now you've got, oh, yeah, publishers who say that the wear and tear on a piece is part of the built-in cost. I've
Right.
heard, I mean, there are publishers who will say, like, yeah, we price this because we know it's only going to last you about 10 years and then you're going to have to buy more copies. I don't like that concept at all,
Mm-hmm.
personally. I don't think of like Beckenhorst prices as like having wear and tear built in because in 10 years you're going to have to now if you do, fine. And I mean we'll be glad to get your order. And I know paper does wear out eventually, but for me, I'm like, hey, take care of your music. And it's not like you have to replace it in X amount of time. I feel like that's just
Right.
putting people over a barrel a little bit. Like, just my opinion.
And I don't
Not
think
trying to
it's
credit anybody
realistic.
who says that.
It's not a
But yeah.
realistic. It's not a realistically common scenario either. So, for example, I teach. So, I teach at a high school, outside of Kansas City that's it's a suburban program, but it's a high school choir program that's over 100 years old, probably coming up on 115 years old. And
Wow.
about 6, 7 years ago, we remodeled the choir room, and part of what, and as in tore everything down to the studs, and it was a big construction project, and everything was redone in there. And as part of preparing for that, we had to empty out this 100-year-old choir library, and
Wow.
completely. And it's a huge, like just massive library, and we had music in there that was yellow and falling apart, like the paper so old that it would crumble to the touch,
Mm.
that kind of thing. Things with like publishing dates of 1905, 1907, stuff like that, and I can tell you that any music that was that old, we weren't going to be ordering new copies of that.
Yeah.
That was either gonna be digitally preserved so we could have a copy of it still, or thrown away because it probably had some like horrible language or offensive stuff in it or whatever.
Yeah, right.
You know, and so I wonder if that in that scenario, if that's really a common enough thing to where a choir would do. Now, I guess maybe copies of things like Handel's Messiah, an organization does it every year at Christmas time, or whatever. Those are the types of things that you might actually resell multiple copies of that. But
Mhm.
how often does that really happen?
Yeah. Like Beckenhorst's best-selling piece is John Nesbeck's Every Valley.
Okay.
Um, and that's like musically, it is not what I want to be hearing. It was one of his first publications, and it sounds like it's straight out of the 70s, but like we've sold about 1 million copies of
Oh
that
wow.
thing over its lifetime. And to this day, we sell a good number of copies every year simply from choirs that still want to perform it, replacing their worn out copies. They're not people who are just hearing it for the first time. It's people who are like, yeah, we still want to do this, but our copies are just shot. So yeah, it does happen, but I don't think it's a lot. I
Right.
guess like, going back to the main question here, there's kind of two issues. One is, do you have unlimited number of copies, and the other is, do you have unlimited amount of time? So where I come down kind of in the middle of that is, I'm not out to say your copies are only good for 10 years and then we expect you to replace them because we plan on wear and tear. If you ask me if any of those pieces are Beckenhorst that are in your library that are worn out, and you say, hey, can I digitize these? I would say yes, absolutely. You already purchased those. I don't expect you to purchase more copies just because they're worn out. But I would say, like, however many copies you have, please only use that many digital copies. And then if you need more, just come to our website and pay for 15 more digital copies. Whether you use that PDF or just make 15 more of your own, that's where my slightly naive trust comes in.
Right.
Like, pay for the number of copies you use, but I don't care how long you use them. I hope you get to use them for another 40 years.
Yeah. No, that's really good. And now here, this would be maybe a way to wrap this up is, 'cause if I'm thinking about the choir director's realistic hurdles that we have to jump over to get the music from publishers. So let's say you have a scenario like that where you're wanting to digitize something that's older, something that's still under copyright, but you're trying to preserve it from being torn apart or whatever. Well, my understanding is that Dan Forrest could say, hey, yeah, go for it. But wouldn't it still be technically a violation of copyright? Or is an email from Dan Forrest enough to do you have the authority to have wave fairy dust over that Beckenhorst piece and give that permission? Is that how that would work?
Are you asking me as composer or me as publisher
You
representative?
as a representative of Beckenhorst.
So I am not aware of any other entity that would have the right to say, dear Beckenhorst, you're not allowed to let people do that.
Right.
That was a
Okay.
convoluted answer. As far as I know, like, the publisher is the one who copyrighted it, and they can decide what can happen. There
Yeah.
are a few statutory type things where the government has the right to say you have to allow this or whatever, but I don't know of any, like mechanical licensing, for instance. There's a statutory rate and a not coming up, a compulsory license that you have to offer because the government says so. But I'm not personally aware of any situation where the government says you're not allowed to be that generous with your copyright.
Yeah.
It's the publisher's
Uh,
prerogative. So yeah,
Yeah.
you get a letter from the publisher saying go for it, then you're all set.
Right. Now, and that's
Thanks for
great.
asking the publisher. We appreciate it.
Right. Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah. Now, I think where for choir directors sometimes that can become confusing is that, for example, Dan writes me the letter and says it's okay to do that for this piece. And so for
Mhm.
some people, they think, oh, that just what that means is it's okay to digitize old music. And then they take
Mhm.
that they take that as an extrapolation then to everything in their library, because
Right.
not because they're trying to cheat, but because they don't understand the complexities of how the old model of buying the physical copy now translates into this digital world where we can scan and store, and then print. 5 years from now, when after we've scanned and stored, what would you either how would you explain that, or do you guys see that as an issue? Is it stressful for you as a publisher at all?
Yeah, the main thing is policies vary from publisher to publisher.
Right, it's
So
tricky.
I think you just that choral director is just going to need to write each of the publishers involved. There's not like a central clearinghouse for that kind of permission. You're just going to have to contact each of those. For me personally, my guiding rule is only use music that's been paid for. I think that covers it.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if you want to digitize something that has already been purchased and you're just trying to digitize it for future use, me speaking for Beckenhorst, I don't mind that. I don't want you to use more digitized copies than you paid for. Again, if you need more of those, just come to our website and pay for more so that you can support the artist who created it and help keep
Mhm.
us in business. Thank
Yeah.
you. But as long as you are using paid copies, that's fine by me. It gets tricky when other publishers don't see it that way, and they'll say, "No, you may not digitize. We expect you to buy new copies or buy digital copies." I wish for choral directors that we're a little more consistent across the industry, so there was just kind of accepted practice instead of publisher by publisher.
Yeah.
But they're at some point they control that, and they can set their policy.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think that would be very helpful. But at the same time, I think that what the way you explained it, just then, of just if you're using the music, use music that you paid for. If you're not sure if you paid for it, you probably didn't. That kind of
I
thing.
like that.
Yeah, and so as a kind of a way to add that to how we think about it, I think that's very valuable. So before we kind of wrap this up, I would like to have you finish with one kind of reflection, since we've talked a lot about publishing. You as a composer, when you are wearing that hat, so first at Beckenhorst, do you publish stuff with you don't publish and edit your own stuff there at Beckenhorst, do you, or do you send it out to someone else? How does that work?
I do. I publish my own music there. Craig Courtney has been the editor there for 30 years, or maybe more than 30. He is the one who first offered me a job to come work alongside him and gradually get
Ah,
more the ropes.
mm-hmm.
And he's still very active alongside me. So, like, we were on the phone today talking about some submissions. Should we take this? Does this work for us or not? So my pieces get run by him. So I get somebody else's input into my pieces a bit. And then I have a couple other trusted friends that I occasionally send something to, like, hey, how does this strike you? Do you have any input on this? Somebody else's perspective is always helpful when I can get it. I try not to be a burden or presume upon people, but yeah, that's important. But then,
Yeah.
yeah, I do publish my church music with Beckenhorst for sure. And I think that's really healthy because I'm a part of the same process as the composers that I edit. I'm in that same paradigm and that same process with
Yeah.
them, right alongside them, even though I also have this other hat that I wear. I think that's really important to be on both sides of that.
Yeah. Now that's really good, and I have a question that I ask all the composers that I talk to. It's kind of a weird question. So if you could tell us about one of your pieces that people really like, but you're surprised about that, and or in other words, that you were surprised at how much people liked it, and or a piece that you wrote that you really were hoping people would grab up and just go for, but it didn't get the reception that you were hoping that it did.
Oh, you should have thrown that to me in advance so I could think about it.
That's okay.
I'm actually the worst like encyclopedic knowledge of my own library. I
Uh-huh.
literally get on my own website to see what I wrote,
That's okay.
10 years ago
That's
or
okay.
something. Yeah, there certainly are pieces like that, but to just pull up one off the top of my head, I'm terrible at that kind of thing.
So you said your
Um,
Requiem is your one of your most popular ones or one of your most sustaining ones. Is that
that's probably
something?
my most widely performed piece. Yeah.
Okay. Would you say that when you wrote it, was that something you expected, or did that take you by surprise?
No, I was very surprised.
Okay.
I had this little bit of hope that it
Hmm.
might have a life. I mean, I expected it to have at least a little bit of life beyond the premiere.
Uh-huh.
But it was my first major work like that, and it's so difficult to get major works published. You kind of have to climb your way up the ladder to build trust with people before they would even consider something like that. And then it's just so hard to get people to commit to something of that size.
Yeah.
But I tried to write it so that maybe it would have a life beyond that. At the premiere, I thought, boy, I feel like this is a good piece, but I don't know where it'll go. Um, I think Hinshaw had already committed to publishing it at that point. They had seen the manuscript and said, "Yeah, we want this." But
Uh-huh.
then it was at the Hinshaw like celebration thing they used to have annually that the second ever performance was, and I heard the rehearsal at that, and that was where I had kind of an epiphany, like, "Whoa, I this might really do something." Like,
Hmm.
I don't. I'm hearing things that are much better than I thought, and I didn't expect them to be this like impactful. And if I'm feeling it, then maybe other people are going to feel it too. And then they did. Everybody loved it,
Yeah.
and
That's the best.
so next week is the 10th anniversary of the premiere, and the Hickory Choral Society who premiered it. It's been performed 1,000 times around the world. So we're having
Wow.
like a 10 years, 1,000 performances celebration next
That's
week.
awesome.
It'll
Yeah,
be fun.
it is a beautiful work. I've heard it performed. I've never sung it, but I've heard it. I've been in the audience, and it's a wonderful piece. So what would be something kind of? I'm just going to help guide you to the other part of my question then, because I'm curious. What would be a piece that maybe choir directors who are listening, you of yours that you really wish we would go take a look at it because it just maybe didn't isn't as well known, but you think it's worthy of being well known.
um, I have a piece. Yeah, two of them come to mind, actually. One is called Abide. Have you ever heard Abide?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, the text is by Jake Adam York. I am more fond of that piece at the risk of sounding narcissistic. I think that text setting came out really well. It's a little long. I don't remember the length. It might be more like 7 minutes, not three or four.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's not terribly difficult, but I love that text. And I think the musical setting works well, but I don't know that it always gets noticed the way I wish it did.
Yeah.
So there's one for you.
Okay.
The
That's great.
other is a piece, a piece called Himenami, which is in Japanese. And Tony Silvestri wrote the text. It was commissioned by a Japanese choir in memory of tsunami victims
Mm-hmm.
from the early 2010s. And so he wrote it in traditional Japanese literary forms. You know, the number of syllables per line. There's haiku, and then there's tanka, and these other things that happen. And then in the stanza where the tsunami hits, that gets just destroyed, and it's all chaotic, and the structure's not there. And then the final stanza is about how like the sun rises again over Japan, and the structure returns again to those poetic forms. Just beautiful poetry and meaning, and it's understated in this beautifully elegant Zen kind of way. And then, as if that wasn't good enough, the Japanese choir that premiered it, a member of that choir translated it into Japanese, and
Mm.
she managed to get the same number of syllables that he did when she went to Japanese. So we like reverse engineered this Japanese poetry. And at the premiere, they sang it in English during the concert, and then sang it in Japanese as the encore to the concert. And Tony and I were both there, just like complete lifetime bucket list kind of experience. And it
Wow.
resonated so well with those people. I mean, the Japanese, I don't think, are typically known for being overly emotional.
Mm-hmm.
But there were just people weeping and just thanking us profusely. And it was such an honor for like this American guy to go over there and try to give voice to these people who had suffered so much and had so much loss, and to be a part of their commemoration for it. It
That's
hasn't
awesome.
necessarily caught on as a big choral hit, but there's a
Yeah.
lot of depth and experience for me to that piece.
That's awesome. Very cool. Well, Dan, I really appreciate your time. And of course, I will put a link to your website in the show notes. Any other things that after we sign off of like things that you really want us to know, folks to know about your music or Beckenhorst or any of those things, we'll add kind of a little digital business card for you on the way out, so people can keep up with you and also can find your music because, of course, we know that it's very beautiful stuff. But I appreciate your time.
Thanks for the invite, Chris. It's been fun to jabber about all this crazy industry stuff. I hope it's
Absolutely.
helpful.
Yeah, no, it will be. It's very good. I appreciate you, and we'll be in touch soon.
Good. Thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you all for listening to the end of an episode. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, there are lots of things that you can do to keep the show afloat, but also to just participate in the conversation. You can go to choralosophy.com. There are a lot of ways to leave me a message there. You can go to Choralosopher's Facebook page and join the conversation there as well. And then, of course, the best way to get in touch with me is on Patreon, patreon.com/choralosophy. Jump in for $3 or more a month there for the benefits that Patreon brings, as well as the direct connection to a very supportive group that happens there. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.